Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Apollo Case Study Series. We're at number 4. It's amazing. This has been a fun project. I'm joined, as always, for the Apollo Case Study Series by my good buddy, Dr. Jim Moore. And we have a very special guest joining us as well, Jen Friedman. And Jim, well, we're going to start by getting to know Jen a little bit, certainly, and then I'm going to hand over the reins to you because this is the concept of this show is kind of near and dear to your heart, and you guys are closest to the ground on what we're going to talk about. So I have the enviable position of being an audience member, essentially. I shouldn't say I might. I'll probably jump in here and there. Let's be honest, guys. But for the most part, I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say. And before we get into the conversation itself, for those listening along, I just want to thank Apollo Behavior for putting this case study series together. It's been something that I've learned a lot from, and the feedback that I've been getting from listeners has been really good as well. So people seem to be responding to this really practitioner-focused information that I think everyday BCBAs can relate to. If people want to know more about Apollo, I'll include links to the Apollo website and their social media channels, etc., on the show notes for this episode. So you can go to behavioralobservations.com and look for the Apollo Case Study Series number 4, or frankly, you can find any of them that should have this information. So that housekeeping notwithstanding, let's get started, folks. So Jen, again, welcome to Behavioral Observations. Let's talk about how we always start the show. Let's talk about how you got into the behavior analysis in the first place. So if you can let us know how you encountered it and what made you want to pursue it as a career.
Yeah, so I was at the University of Michigan for undergrad. I was studying psychology, and I knew that I wanted to work with just kids, mostly kids on the spectrum. But Michigan's a very social work centered field. So, when I was going to counseling sessions, the only advice they could give me was counseling or social work. So that was my path. And then growing up in Atlanta, I had always heard about Marcus. So I went out of my way to get an internship there. So I got an internship there sophomore year of college, where I was just working at a social skills camp. And when I was there, I was introduced to the severe behavior clinic. And I made it my mission to get an internship doing severe behavior. So summer after junior year of college, I interned in the severe behavior unit for a summer. I worked under Colin Muthing, and I thought he was just the smartest guy ever. And I really, really enjoyed, I just really enjoyed the environment. I enjoyed the research. It was the first encounter with ABA I had ever gotten, but I was hooked. So talked to Colin a little bit, got some information about master's programs, and he had gone to UT Austin for his doctorate. So I started looking into the master's program. So I ended up going to UT Austin for my master's in education with concentration in autism and developmental disabilities, and moved back to Atlanta in the middle of COVID. Started working at Apollo in November. I was actually the second employee. So I've really grown from the RBT role to the BCBA role with Apollo. I always say, Kristen, I'm like a little product of Kristen, our operations director. She was clinic director at the time. So yeah, I've been really, really lucky to be able to step into from a case manager role to a case supervisor role. And it's just made me fall in love with the field even more. So I really attribute it back to Marcus. So.
I see. So you had familiarity with them just as a citizen of, or being in the Atlanta community more generally?
Yeah, exactly. I'm Jewish. So, everybody always grows up hearing about Bernie Marcus. So it had definitely been a conversation when I was younger, and I was just babysitting for kids that were on the spectrum. And it was just my mom kind of brought it up in conversation, and I did my research. Really, really loved it there.
I see. I guess as just a quick observation, you're probably one of the first guests I've had that, kind of grew up with a knowledge of autism relative to some other guests who may have encountered it later on, or at least knowledge of an ABA provider like Marcus. So I think that's just an interesting footnote to the evolution of our field, which is perhaps another way of saying that, maybe it's just a way of me saying that I'm getting on in years. So I don't know. Maybe it's a combination of both. Jim, what say you?
It just, when I hear things like this, it just reminds me of how small our field still is. We talk so much about this rapid explosion, but to think that Jen, who was at the University of Michigan, which, my mentor, Wayne Fisher, did his undergraduate in the state of Michigan and then left to find behavior analysis. So there's one degree of Kevin Bacon. And then she goes to Marcus, that then leads her to UT at Austin, where my good friend and colleague, Terry Falcamata, is the program director. And Terry was an extern. He kind of did the same thing Jen did, is after he graduated from SIU as an undergraduate at Mark Dixon's lab, he came to Marcus and spent a year there with us as an extern, and then went on to get his PhD with Dave Wacker and Joel Ringdahl. And it just kind of seems that there's, our genealogies, professionally, academically, however you want to look at it, are still not that long. And, maybe it can make us feel older. I do feel older when I hear, what Jen knows of Marcus is that beautiful building on Piedmont. I remember the old abandoned AT&T building we were originally in, and how we had to make a makeshift severe behavior clinic and feeding clinic out of that. But the truth is, Matt, we are getting older. I mean, come on, our BCBA number is under 1,000. So Matt's is actually lower than mine.
Oh. I'm glad you never waste an opportunity to bring that up. So anyway, all joking aside, Jim, set the stage for what you had planned to talk about here, and then let's dig in. I'm really looking forward to hearing what's on both your minds.
So, in our first 3 episodes, we kind of talked about some conceptual and theoretical foundations under which we're building our model at Apollo. And that's great. But I really felt it was important to bring members of our team on to really talk about their experiences with that. We're not just up here talking, butterflies and rainbows, that we're actually trying to do the hard work of putting these things together clinically. It's a journey. It's not been, I don't want to say that it's been difficult to suggest it's aversive, but it is a lot of work, to bring in BCBAs from different training backgrounds, somewhat different orientations, different experiences, and say, okay, we're all going to rally around this clinical model. So I was kind of hoping today to really, because, the thing I love about working with Jen is she's very open. She's a good skeptic. She is not a cynic. So she will say, okay, I'm going to trust you, Dr. Moore, but I'm going to also ask a lot of questions. I'm going to verify what you're telling me, which is exactly the type of BCBA I want working on our team here at Apollo. So I really just thought we'd try to maybe hit some points from the first 3 episodes and kind of have Jennifer talk about her experience with each of those, kind of starting with our scientific problem-solving model. And just because that's the first thing I really unveiled to the team when I started at Apollo, is that, hey, our practice, there's a lot of debate about, are you a researcher, a scientist practitioner, or just a practitioner? I think that there's no way. And, Jennifer, in our first episode, one of my tasks was to convince Matt that he was a scientist. And I think I succeeded a little bit on that, is that this is a natural science-based field. So tell me a little bit from your experience, because I know you've been other places, not just Marcus, you've been other places. And how does the approach we use here at Apollo to scientific problem solving differ from other things you've experienced in your career, or how has it benefited your development at this point as a still a fairly new BCBA?
So the problem solving method has helped me think about the why anytime I see a conflict. I think when I was in RBT and I really first started, you're studying for the exam and you memorize this list of, okay, I see this behavior maintained by this function. These are the potential interventions for it. And it's almost very rigid when you're first studying for it, and it's kind of information overload. This method has allowed me to take a step back and really think about the reasoning beyond just what I memorized in my textbooks, and more what is specific to this client, what is specific to the therapist. Is this a therapist issue? Is this a client issue? And how can we fix it before I go in and change the program? So I think initially I would have just gone in and changed the program if I saw something wasn't working. And now I'm a lot less impulsive when I am thinking about programming. And I really want to establish instructional control. I think Dr. Moore has been a really good influence in helping me identify if what we're doing is working for the client. And one DTT for one client is not going to be the same DTT for another. So I have really appreciated being able to take a step back, potentially spend my entire supervision just trying to identify one problem and the cause for one problem, and then troubleshooting and then taking action on it. And it's helped the therapist too feel better about making mistakes or doing something that isn't working, because I'm encouraging them that that's all a part of experimenting. You know, if everything's perfect the first time, then there's no room for science and there's no room for an experiment. We want to be able to change and encourage people to make mistakes so that they can change and adapt for the next time. So it's definitely
I love, I think one of the things, and I have a follow-up question to that specific to you, Jen, but I think what I've noticed working with a lot of new BCBAs, not just at Apollo, but at other points in my career, is there is this huge anxiety about messing up and making a mistake. But it's a good thing in science if we're really following. Now, if we're just casually throwing intervention protocols around, those kind of mistakes are a little bit more careless. But when you're really following the scientific method as you're trying to solve problems, mistakes or things you don't expect actually help you get to better methodologies. And I think it's really empowered our team to feel real comfortable to say, listen, I don't have to knock it out of the park the first time I try something. But specific to you, Jennifer, I remember when we first started, how would you say specifically our attitude of parsimony has impacted your formulation of protocols, especially behavior reduction protocols?
When I first started, if I saw one intervention wasn't working, I would go to the most complex answer, because I don't know if it was just excitement, it was nerves. I was worried that there was something really big that I was missing, that I would just immediately throw the kitchen sink as Kristen says. I would just throw the kitchen sink at my clients based on what I had done in the past, rather than really identifying the problem, from the back end. So it's helped me, because 9 out of 10 times, it's just an issue of basic instructional control and motivation. And I never would have thought about that from the beginning. I just wasn't really thinking, it seems obvious. If my client's not motivated, he's not going to want to do anything. But I was able to see what motivation looks like, and know that deficits and targets are not always skill deficits, that sometimes they really are continued performance deficits, and it's just an issue of motivation. And that, I think, is the most parsimonious explanation, that I ever see. And it doesn't all just come down to the targets written incorrectly.
I think that's a really important point, because, a lot of times, I know when I was a young BCBA, there was a certain level of expectation that came with who I trained under. And yet my approach was so overly complex at times. Mm-hmm. And, I really had to train myself to kind of, as Einstein says, out of complexity, find simplicity. And I really appreciate how our team has kind of rallied around that. One of the questions Matt asked in the first episode was, how did you get initial buy-in from your team to really start thinking of themselves as scientists? Because as you know, not every member, not every BCBA has had a background that includes a research facility like Marcus. And I think that was one of the important things, is to really kind of rally around and trust the process, mm-hmm. to steal a Philadelphia 76er saying. But that kind of shifts into the next thing that we really tried to do together, which was our universal protocol. And I get asked a lot about that because a lot of clinics really don't employ just a basic, almost from PBIS tier 1 protocol. Talk a little bit about your own experience initially. What were some of the challenges, if any, and then where do you see the benefit in us using a basic behavior management protocol for all clients when they first arrive at Apollo?
So my biggest challenge was that I'm an incredibly impatient person, where if a kid starts, I just immediately start identifying all the things that I can work on and wanting to get right into it, that I don't want to spend all this time just trying to build up instructional control and build up school readiness. I just want to get right into the target so that they can, go as fast as, so we can go as fast as possible. They can get out of therapy as fast as possible. And I was doing very individualized behavior plans from the get-go and was changing them so often because I would find kids would start and I did not know them as well as I thought I did from an assessment. So I think just in terms of the universal protocol with skill acquisition, it's been really beneficial because it's helped me be patient. It's helped me really build up the school readiness skills and the attending skills first. And it's helped me identify the priority of it, because I have seen what's happened when I have built up those attending skills first and then slowly intertwine targets, and just how much of a difference it makes. And then in terms of behavior management, I think it's helpful for new staff who come on that if there's a day that staff have to go to different teams, we're not worrying that we have to sit there and supervise somebody for 8 hours a day because they don't know a child's programming. I have comfort knowing that every staff member knows, all right, inappropriate behaviors, put them on extinction, differentially reinforce appropriate behaviors. Make it really, really fun. I tell all of them, if a client is angry about doing something and they're having a huge tantrum, don't just sit there and turn away and act like you're bored too. If you go and have fun and engage with something else without them, that's where the motivation is going to come. They're not going to be motivated for you or your attention or the things that you're playing with if you're not having fun either. So it's definitely helped with consistency. And then you can you take that as a starting point and then individualize the behavior plan to each client. But 9 out of 10 times, the basic steps to instructional control, the basic protocol that we have implemented here has been effective with clients from the get-go.
I just want to make a comment here. That sounds interesting, because I was going to ask you, do you feel that, with everything, there's a pro and con to every, decision that one can make. And I was wondering if you feel like it sounds like on balance, this universal protocol is helpful. And I was about to ask you, do you feel like you've lost anything by not starting with right out of the gate with, one of these more sophisticated interventions that you were, used to implementing? But if you're saying, your observations are not, that it's generally successful, that kind of answers the question. But I don't know if it's worth exploring that anymore, or is it, so sounds like you're finding that it's the case that you have to do kind of those individualized assessment and intervention packages much less frequently.
We actually looked at those data, Kristen and I did earlier in the week, and it's shocking that my first 6 months at Apollo, when we had one clinic and a fraction of the number of clients that we do now, that we actually did 3 times as many clients when we ratioed it out on behavior intervention plans. than we do now when we have 3 clinics, significantly higher client census now. It follows the PBIS literature pretty closely, is that we're able to now reserve those more sophisticated and complicated and intensive services for those children who absolutely need that. And about the other 85 to 90% of the disruptive behavior you might see in a clinic is really effectively handled through just good basic contingency management.
Yeah, I have the exact same thing. I think what has helped me is, ironically, having a universal protocol has actually encouraged me to individualize even more, because I have a starting point and now I can tweak it to really fit the client. Whereas I think beforehand I was saying, oh, I did this exact protocol with a client a year ago with similar behaviors, with similar functions. Let me try it now. And I think now this has actually helped me be more creative and tweak some of the basic behavior managements to fit client needs. And it really has been more effective, especially for kids who really do not like physical prompting. I have one of my clients, we will never physically prompt him. And first, his behavior plan was 3-step guided compliance. Well, we can't do that because all that's going to do is tarnish the relationship, potentially lead to trauma, create aversive experiences, really ruin the rapport. So I was able to modify it from there and find some really good procedures to do with kids who are really averse to physical prompting. So just an example of how I've really been able to individualize it.
And I think the rationale that we used is so true, is that, I've been working in the field and with families long enough that, these kids are not coming from the home of 2 highly trained behavior analysts. They're coming from, regular everyday people who don't know a lot about how behavior works. So these kids come with very mixed histories of reinforcement, very weak sources of stimulus control. So it makes very little sense to me to try and use, very complex procedures to identify the function of a behavior from a very muddled history and then try to move forward from that. It seems like, hey, why don't we come and build some consistency, build some stronger stimulus control, and hey, also train the caregivers on these procedures too, so that they can see some pretty quick quality of life improvements in their own home. I remember the first part of my career, we would have these kids and they would be perfect at the clinic. Their data looked beautiful, and mom and dad would say, well, that's great. We still can't take him out in public because he loses his mind. Mm-hmm. And I think that we've seen that this really helps us take very mixed histories of reinforcement and start to put some good consistency in that establishes those prerequisite skills that they need to really start acquiring skills. Mm-hmm. So, well, of course, the big focus that a lot of people attribute to Apollo is our very intentional efforts to embed stimulus equivalence learning and relational frame theory into our programming. And we're behavior analysts and we love our data, and we're collecting those data to support our claims. But before we get in to your experience with your outcomes, Jen, talk to us a little bit about your initial experiences, because you kind of came in and you were gung-ho and said, I don't have a lot of experience in this, but I really, really want to learn. So talk to us about some of the peaks and some of the valleys and the challenges and some of the victories that you encountered going from, like I did, a background where these things were not included to now learning about relational responding.
Right. I had heard of Peak when I was in Austin and didn't really get the chance to learn much about it in my clinic because COVID happened. So when Dr. Moore brought us Peak and was telling us about it, I was already so excited. And just even seeing the graphs where you can see client outcomes, typical child outcomes, and then children in ABA services, it was just, you could see the gap widening and widening. We were directly teaching so many skills. And for a kid that's mastered 500 skills, why is it that they're still behind? And it's absolutely true. I'm constantly trying to refute the argument of ABA just creates robots and everything is just so strict and rigid. And this was really the first time I had heard of something that has shown flexibility and has really increased independence. You know, Dr. Moore told the story about a client he had that would stand at the door and just say, welcome to my home, welcome to my home, welcome to my home. And it wasn't generalizing. We weren't able to say different things. And it was really, really aversive to potentially interrupt it. So when Dr. Moore was just giving us these examples, when he was doing his training with us, where he was giving us the opportunity to think from a stimulus equivalence perspective, I thought it was amazing. And he let us choose one client from the get-go that we wanted to start everything with. So the client I chose I was at the Johns Creek Clinic. He's actually now one of my kids at East Cobb. And I was able to see the benefit very, very quickly. I mean, his skills just skyrocketed. When we built up his joint attention skills, his attending, his school readiness, it's unbelievable what he was able to achieve. And it just helped me reframe my idea of DTT and ABA and know that I may teach 10 direct skills, but then with that, I can get all these other things for free and I'm getting my kids out of therapy sooner. I do not want to just sit and teach everything directly and to where my kids can only respond in one room, in one setting with one therapist. My goal with RFT, it's just creating relationships between common stimuli. That's how I explain it to parents. It's instead of just having like a file cabinet of these are the expressive ID objects that I've learned and these are the prepositions that I've learned. RFT ensures that there are not these file cabinets, and instead they're all just relating to each other, and it's generalization essentially.
Yeah. I think real quick to give some more context, the story Jennifer's talking about is I was at a large gathering of some of our political leaders in Mississippi and lots of families who had children impacted by autism, and the host's son. And I don't want to discount the life-changing benefits that the ABA he encountered brought into his life. But he had hit that typical plateau that we see with his social behavior and his lack of behavioral flexibility. There were probably about 80 people at this gathering, and they brought him out and said, hey, welcome everyone to our home. And he literally went to every person, looked them in the eye with those very sometimes odd, discrete social behaviors we teach them, like turning their shoulders, looking them in the face, which I don't even do usually. And he did that. After I saw he went to the first 4 people, I was like, it's not even dawning upon him. He's not even discriminating the fact that he could just say that to everyone. And now the fact that he said it to these 4 people, and the more his mother tried to get him to stop, the more upset he became. Mm-hmm. I was like, wow, I've seen that time after time after time, these wonderful life-changing stories of children who didn't talk, had lots of problem behavior, and now they have a really great expressive vocabulary. But when you put them in social situations, they fall apart because they don't have enough flexibility in their repertoire to deal with the dynamic idiosyncratic changes that can happen in environmental stimuli in most social contexts. And so that was just a little bit of context there. And, I think what's beautiful about this is, we're kind of leaning into the pragmatic side of our theoretical orientation here. And we're not really worrying about, I get people all the time, I'll get messages saying, instead of, relational frames, don't you think it's this or it's that or it's the other? And it very well could be. But given the type of outcomes, and not just with our data, with what you see, our CEO talks to Jennifer's client every time he's at East Cobb, and it just blows me away. We've taken a kid who 2 years ago, or not even 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, screamed and hollered and tantrumed all the time, to now he plays t-ball. He went skiing with his family. He makes friends much more easily and fluidly than we ever thought he could. And that that speaks more to his family, who, when we first started working with them, Jen can tell you, they were terrified that their child would have no future. The things that they're seeing in the everyday behavior of their son has more power in it than any graph we could ever put in front of them. So that's kind of a good segue into talking about your biggest success story. And you've had more than just one client. Now this is an approach, obviously, that, you know, you've kind of seen what I've talked about. It's like, hey, we're all on this kind of from basic attending to verbal behavior through RFT road. Some kids are further down that road. So you're really trying to incorporate some of these, the same approach with all of our kids while still individually tailoring it. What would you say? I actually have a different client in mind that I think might be your biggest success story and will continue to show that as you work with him. But what would you say is your biggest success story so far working under our clinical model?
I know exactly which client you're talking about, and it really is a toss-up. I think that because this particular client was my very first client as a BCBA, it's been, I think just the change has been so drastic because it has been almost 2 years. And because during his assessment, the amount of skills I saw during his initial assessment to now is the biggest change that I have seen. So he, as Dr. Moore said, you know, he was screaming, crying. I couldn't get anything during my assessment with him. And we began just working on school readiness, tolerating sitting at the table. We worked on showing ready behavior. So I really wanted to build up the foundational learning skills, because without attending and without advanced attending, we can't begin to work on stimulus equivalence. So I really started building up the table, started making it more fun for him, building up his motivation and finding things that really were reinforcing and not just fun for him. And once we really got down the motivation, responding to look, scanning an array, then we were gradually increasing demands. And, you know, at first I was just building up the foundational learning skills. So I was making sure that we were able to keep our hands still, that we were able to scan an array, that we were able to find a block under a cup, object permanence, that we were able to respond to the instruction look. And then pretty soon after I started working on that, I started introducing symmetrical targets. So that was just doing visual discrimination just to see if he could do simple deriving. So I remember the first target I did with him was food sources. So I would have a picture of bacon, salmon, cheese, and then a picture of an animal. And I would tell him to match same. So we're just starting to build up his ability to match two things that aren't the same. Once I was able to teach that directly, I started probing to see if we were deriving, if we were just simply reversing the A to B, the B to A. And once he got that, it was like he got the first one, and then he got the second, third, fourth, fifth, and then we were just blowing through targets to where I was able, every single target in his session is framed as to build up the relational frame, to build up the derived relational responding. So we're no longer doing expressive ID of every body part, expressive ID of emotions. Instead, we're first teaching the receptive ID for everything and then treating the expressive as a derived. So since April, May of last year, I have not directly taught him, I don't think, any expressive target. There are very few I have directly taught him. And he's blown through it. And when I started to see his ability to derive and reverse relationships, it's like when you ask him a question, you can see his wheels turning. You know, he starts thinking, he'll go, truck. Grandma has a truck. There was a truck at my house. You know, he'll just starting to create those relationships instead of it just being, oh, I saw a truck and I learned that it's a truck in my clinic. We're now recalling events. We're more environmentally aware. And every single day he comes to me with new language and new things that he's just picking up from his environment. And I really do attribute it to Peak.
You know, I think what I was actually thinking of was a client you had here at Johns Creek that actually did not have vocal speech. He was using a device, didn't seem like he was using it all that well.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that example is great too. But what Jen really challenged me on is she's wanted to take these methodologies to clients that even some of the peak and RFT enthusiasts I've seen in the field would say, no, they're not really appropriate, and say that, hey, this kid, there may be a multitude of reasons why we don't have vocal speech. That does not necessarily mean they don't have a speaker as listener repertoire that we could build. And sure enough, as soon as we started using equivalence programs with this young man he had seen everything you could see in ABA. He had been with another provider for 6 or 7 years, had kind of been labeled as this behavior problem. And we just immediately started to see that, hey, the more we focus on his deriving, the less we really have to focus on problem behavior. And so I think, I've just seen clients, and I kind of, with us growing, I have the tremendous benefit now of not seeing our clients every single day. And so I believe the client Jim was talking about there at East Cobb, I can remember when he came in and looked like, wow, this is going to be one of your typically impossibly hard vocal stereotypy, automatically reinforced vocal stereotypy kids. And it's going to be nothing seems to reinforce his behavior. And now, literally week to week, I tell Jen, I feel like I'm looking at a different kid. His data look great. What's more important to me is when I put my eyes on him, I'm like, wow, not just the sheer bulk of the number of words he uses, but his flexibility. I don't think I even told you, Jen, I heard him leaving the clinic last week with his mother, and she said, how was your day? And he literally started telling her about his day as any typically developing 4 or 5-year-old little boy would do. And it was very moving, because that family just saw no future for their child when he started. And now I think they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had a thought here. So those stories, as well as the data that underpin them, sound very compelling. And they're more important than the question I'm going to ask, but I'm curious about the question I'm going to ask. For a specific reason, do you folks see, when you see these clients make these, I guess, very large scale changes, do you guys ever get feedback from the payers, the funding people who are, because I'm wondering, like, when you go to reauthorize for services and things like that, I'm just curious if when they see changes in whatever outcome measures that you submit to them, and I know there's a variety of ways of doing that. And I'm concerned about this for a reason, because I know the payers want to see outcomes, and that's a challenge for the field more generally, of course. And so, and again, just to be very clear, I think the actual differences in these clients' lives, the relief of stress that their families have, the increased opportunities that these clients have for freedom and independence, are way more important. But I'm also concerned about the field the ABA field as a going proposition, and so I'm hoping that the funding sources are also seeing some of these and appreciating some of these differences, these massive changes that you're describing here.
I think it's a little early to tell here in Georgia, because I still think a minority of practitioners are taking this approach across the country, and especially here in Georgia. What my experience was in Mississippi is, after about 3 years post-mandate, the payers really started looking, because their big drive now is value-based care. And that's a real big challenge for our field, because most people use criterion referenced assessment data that's really not standardized across the field. And so what we started to see in Mississippi is, after about our 3rd year, they really started to notice that, wow, you not only are you getting these incredible outcomes, you really are reducing the client's need for treatment over time. If we were on a really good track record that I believe we're on now at Apollo as well, is if we can get them at 2 or earlier, and there's not another disabling condition present as well, we feel very confident that we can move them into typically developing settings by the time they're ready to enter kindergarten. Mm-hmm. That to me is, we have to show, I do share your concern, Matt, that I fear that there are a lot of approaches to ABA. The client I just mentioned to Jen, we have 2 other clients here at our Johns Creek location that had received ABA for multiple years before coming to us to see no progress, and now taking the same structured approach, starting with a universal protocol, building instructional controls, starting to try and build basic symmetrical derived relational responding. Now we're seeing even those clients start to make progress. I don't think this is meant to be, from birth to death. Mm-hmm. Some kids, I realize some individuals are going to need lifelong support, obviously. But I think for a large number of children on the autism spectrum, the sooner and more, not just the sooner can we get treatment, the sooner we can get effective treatment in place, you would hope to see that over time. I don't want to have to deal with children 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, because I want them to have the same experiences that my children have of going to school and going to recess and, being in the band or, playing t-ball, some of the things that we're seeing our clients do now. I think our field has a major hurdle that we're going to have to get across when it comes to, one, how do we show value in a highly idiographic-based field to payers and other consumers that take the larger, more nomothetic approach? Mm-hmm. How do we, it's like in a meeting this morning, Kristen pulled up one of our clients and said, Central Reach here tells me that he's mastered 426 targets since he started with us. That sounds like a big number, but what does it mean? And that's the question all of us should be asking. Mm-hmm. Is, a lot of us are still driven by the kind of old criterion referenced approach that, hey, I got to get 500 TAC targets in this kid's repertoire. How meaningful is that in their overall quality of life? We really need to build repertoires that are flexible, fluid, and grow with minimal support necessary. And I think the approach, and to really kind of do a shout out and a call out to my good friend Mark Dixon, is we need a system that has around 800 operant targets that seem highly correlated with typical development from birth to 16. And we need typically developing age norms, strong ones. We have some now, and we use them at peak. At Apollo, they're getting a little old. Their samples are a little small. So we really need to be able to show to payers, hey, here's our standard of care, here's our standardized unit of progress to put real meaning behind our outcomes. I don't know if that answered that question.
Yeah. And I suppose I should apologize for derailing the conversation into healthcare policy. That really wasn't, I was just again curious about what feedback you're getting specifically, with when you go to reauthorize clients for services and things like that. So, we could do a whole nother podcast on we could do a number of podcasts just on the idiosyncrasies of our field and its relationship to funding, but. I know, Jim, that you had some questions about ACT and things like that. So I kind of want
to make that transition as well and to show that you're always learning in this approach, right, Jen? And a few weeks ago, we had a conversation. She had a client making just tremendous gains, but we got stuck in one area. Mm-hmm. And I remember saying, have you asked him why he keeps selecting a stimulus? And you looked at me and was like, no. I was like, well, if we're building speakers listener covert behaviors, we kind of need to get that public so we can kind of see what's going on there. Mm-hmm. And that was like, that led you and Jeannie and me into this discussion about error correction and how different it is when you're dealing with relational responding. Mm-hmm. If a BCBA with no experience in stimulus equivalence or RFT asked you about your experience, what advice would you give them? And then we'll transition into some things about ACT.
It's easier said than done because I had you as a mentor, Dr. Moore, who's an expert in it. But I think that a good first start, if you have the ability to do a CEU with Dr. Dixon or to do any peak related CEU just to get the hang of it, because it takes a while to really understand what do I do next and what can I do? What do I do first? The starting point's really hard. So I recommend just starting with a CEU to get comfortable with it. Purchasing, if you have the ability, if your company pays for it, or if you're able to buy it, buying just the resources that Dr. Dixon provides through Peak, whether that's just getting the different modules so that you can see the different targets in the direct training, different targets in generalization, equivalence, and transformation. And it'll give you a better idea of how the targets are separated, what's the significance of each module, why I can't just go in order. So definitely doing a CEU would be helpful. And just once you do that, just starting it. And you will learn from starting, making mistakes, figuring out what works with one client and what doesn't for another. But honestly, if you build up motivation and if you build up advanced attending and sitting at the table, school readiness, I can't reiterate enough, motivation a million times. If your client is not smiling, if your client is looking around the room while you're trying to teach targets, they are not going to care about what you are saying. And I have learned that the hard way from kids that I thought they were into what I was doing because I was trying to be really excited and I was trying to be really enthusiastic, but then they weren't getting targets. So I think just really start with motivation, figure out what it is that is actually motivating for your client and what's the topography of their motivation. Are they looking at you? Are they smiling? Are they clapping their hands? Do they get what we call them, the little stimmies for our little ones? They're so cute. So, what does it look like when kids are excited? And when they're motivated in what you're trying to teach them? Not every kid responds well to really heavy, enthusiastic attention. Some kids, I have one that that's what we were doing with him. And then I just asked him, hey, do you prefer if I just give you a fist pump? And he was like, yeah. So now going forward, we just do fist pumps and high fives. So I think that is a really, really good starting point for Peak, is that if you have motivation, it's unbelievable what you can do from that.
What's so satisfying about hearing your answer? And I think this gets into, do you have a trusting relationship with your colleagues, your supervisors, those who are trying to help you with this? Because I can remember early in your journey, Jen, when I would have our BCBAs prepare for rounds that I would come into and go through the steps of scientific problem solving. And I can still remember over a year ago, Jen being really excited about one part of her methodology. And she would look at me and say, what do you think? And I would say, I think you got to work a lot on attending and motivation. Mm-hmm. It looks like your learner doesn't care about what you're doing and is not attending to these wonderful stimuli you've presented. And I think as long as you have a relationship where that's not demeaning, where it's say, hey, we all want to see our clients succeed. That's the key. I think the other thing that I've never actually told you, Jen, is by taking this approach and focusing so much on it, I got to see Jennifer, not BCBA Jennifer, the 3-step guided compliance voice, the way we're all trained when you come from our background, and see Jennifer really get true joy from her clients' behavior. It's really a beautiful thing to watch her work with her clients, and it makes me wish that all children could have someone to give them such authentic joy in their lives. And it's really freed her to not kind of be, it's not just our clients that get criticized for robotic behavior. It's us too, touch car like this, touch car like this, and it's all just kind of monotone and the same level. And just to see Jen in action, and so many members of our Apollo team, just really, when you really say, hey, I'm going to have fun with this client. I'm going to make it my job that we have a good time. It really just becomes a beautiful thing. But, you would think that diving into something new like stimulus and equivalence and RFT would be enough for an up-and-coming BCBA. But when Jen noticed a need in a particular client, he came in, started just some of the most exponential progress we've seen out of new clients. And Jen started looking for more, and that led into acceptance and commitment training. And so talk a little bit, that's a little bit newer in your skill set. Kind of talk to us about what your experience so far with ACT has been and using it as a behavior analyst rather than a talk therapist.
So I took I did a CEU with Dr. Dixon for AIM training, which is it's basically ABA and ACT mixed together, and how we can specifically implement it, especially in school settings. And then I received a lot of guidance from you and some different resources. But taking the CEU, I was introduced to the hexaflex and the point of the hexaflex. So for those who are unfamiliar, there are 6 components to the hexaflex. And if you achieve all 6, that's results in psychological flexibility. And what we struggle with so much with, especially older clients who are really verbally sophisticated, but are just struggling with, behaviors, rigid thinking, ritualistic behaviors, and just honestly, the anxiety that surrounds it. There wasn't really anything that would teach more of that flexibility that wasn't directly taught. I didn't want to just teach one specific instance and this is how you respond to it. I liked this more vague, general idea that ACT presents of this is how I practice acceptance. This is how I practice committed action. This is how I work toward my values. And it was really difficult for me at first to read through the ACT programming. I bought the book, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life. And it's great, but how do I explain that to a 5-year-old? So I actually found the ACT Kid Flex that Dr. Dixon created, and that helped make the terminology a little bit easier. But really what I started with was just teaching the definitions of the hexaflex. And I started incorporating some mindfulness meditation activities into this particular client's day. So we were focusing mostly on just present moment and building up the speaker as listener repertoire. So we would just start off doing a mindfulness activity from the AIM program book that Dr. Dixon wrote. And we would go through it. And at first we got a lot of pushback. This is stupid. I don't like it. And it was because he had just never had to tell anybody what he was thinking. And he didn't even know what it meant when I said, what are you thinking? What did you think just now? So really building up that skill and reinforcing just the self-awareness was a really good first point. So, working on present moment, working on just not continuously asking, when are we getting our toy? When are we going to do this? When are we going to do that? And once we built that up, I was able to start incorporating some value-based language, which I just equated with reinforcers. What are things that make you happy? And he responded really well to that. I have a visual that I made where I wrote, okay, I want you to tell me 5 things that make you happy, 5 things that make you unhappy. And seeing this visual where I said, okay, give me something that you could do that would help you move toward one of these things that makes you happy. And he'd say, well, helping my mom with the dishes. Yeah, awesome. Helping your mom with the dishes, that moves you toward your value of getting to play with your friends and feeling happy. And then I'd say, well, tell me something that moves you away from that moves you toward your brother hitting you. And he would say, well, stealing a game controller. Yeah, perfect. So now he's really gotten familiar with it, where when he does something cool or he does something that's not so cool, we can say, hey, are you moving toward getting to earn your water guns at the end of the month? Or do you think you're moving away from that? and it's built up his self-awareness. And then I've started to incorporate committed action and so on and so forth. So it's been a slow process, and I definitely have a lot to learn. I'm kind of just copying things from the book and doing it with him and seeing what works and what doesn't. But he's the first client that I have done it with. And I now have a client that started last week and another one that's starting soon that are both going to be primarily ACT clients. So I do have a lot to learn, but it is definitely helpful to having been able to equate some of the ACT terminology with behavior analytic terminology. I mean, all of it is just, we're building stimulus control around our private events, is what Dr. Dixon said. We're building up the ability when somebody says, "What are you thinking?" We're able to say it. And we're building up the ability to tact our speaker as listener and then behave accordingly and stop and think before we act. And I think that's been really cool.
I'd like to make I have one point and I guess a question. I guess just a kind of maybe just a pedantic comment here is I want to give credit to Dr. Dana Palalunas, who co-wrote the AIM curriculum. So just to Dana, if you're listening to this, we just want to make sure.
Yes.
Credit where credit's due. And then, but my actual question is, how'd you get beyond the "this is stupid" phase of the introduction of of some of these exercises that, frankly, a lot of clients probably are going to be resistant to? I'm always curious about how that works, or some of the challenges, some of the problem solving around that.
Yeah, and that was simple, just conditioning. We were just conditioning it as a reinforcing activity. We were finding the activities that were fun for him. We were tailoring it a little bit. He loves Minecraft. So we would try to incorporate some Minecraft things into the mindfulness activities. And at the time we were doing this, we were doing a rule board where if we followed our rules for a certain amount of time, we could then earn our choice, to go do whatever we wanted in our motor lab. So it really just was weeks and weeks of immediate reinforcement and making it fun for him, that he just, once he was good at it and was able to do it consistently, he was motivated in itself. So it really was just simple pairing. And he, and making it, knowing that we could individualize it to him. We didn't just have to read exactly what was on the paper. We tailored it to him, especially because he's 5, and some of these things on here, they're a little bit arbitrary, where I just think he didn't understand them. So rephrasing some of them to meet him where he was at was helpful, and knowing that it's okay to kind of modify to fit your client, and that what's written in the AIM protocol or in the ACT protocol, it doesn't have to just be this exact way. It should and is encouraged to be individualized.
Got it. Thank you.
And I think that what's so exciting about this, and I would say that in its application in ABA, we still have a lot to learn about, and we use training instead of therapy, because even though we still do quite a bit of talking with the client, we're really using BST and shaping and just other forms of contingency management to really take this, very rigid, repetitive, very concrete type of covert behavior that will bleed into the public behavior and really start to build some flexibility into that. And so really it's a behavioral skills approach to really, when I think of the Hexaflex, I think of 6 broad response categories that if we build robustly enough and they're working together, helps bridge the gap that our children often have between what's right now, what's happening to me right now, versus things that may have some temporal distance. Years ago, some colleagues of mine and I did a discounting study that we actually never were able to get a journal to get behind, and we compared typically developing kids with ADHD and kids with autism using Leo Green's manipulating delay method. And we found that from a behavioral impulsivity standpoint, children with autism were far more impulsive and had far greater discounting curves than the other populations we looked at. And I think what this does is it kind of forces them to almost pause.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like we're breaking up the rigidity of that covert speaker's listener behavior, and making them go through very tangible activities to say, okay, it's like when Mark and I first started talking about this, and I would talk about it with Dana and her husband, Jordan Belisle. I would say, acceptance, present moment awareness, that's great. Isn't the first step getting the kid to actually realize they're not in their present moment? And going through all those processes, it's really a lot of good ABA applied to their expressive verbal behavior. And with the hopes of, if we can shape up the public behavior, and I know there's probably some behavior analysts listening saying, I was trained that this self-report stuff is a bunch of hooey. Well, right now, what other mechanism do we have other than just get it out there, shape it up as best we can, and hope that generalizes into the private covert behaviors? But I really love how you articulated that. Really showed that, we may have to start with some very direct acting contingencies of reinforcement just to get them motivated to not want to escape these activities altogether. I've talked with Matt many times about how you're going to go through this period of this is stupid, I hate you, I'm going to throw a tantrum so you let me out of this activity because it makes no sense. But if you had to kind of put all of this up in a big summary, compared to when you first came into the field, if you were talking to a caregiver or a teacher, someone not trained in behavior analysis, what would you tell them about the importance of relational responding, relational learning, the types of things that we've been talking about for about the last hour?
I would call attention to the critiques that the ABA field gets, unfortunately, about rigidity, robotic behavior, and the things that you hear all over the internet and that parents come out and say. I would really call attention to that and say that this is how we navigate that rigidity. I do not, and emphasize, I don't want my kids to be in therapy their entire lives. And this is how we ensure that gap between a typically developing kid, a neurotypical kid, and a child on the spectrum, this is how we ensure that gap is not widening. I use the example, like I said, that if you teach 500 targets to a child with autism, 500 targets to a neurotypical child, why is it that the gap keeps going when you start to probe out things that you didn't directly teach? Why is it that a child with autism still is not able to capture all of this new information without sitting at a table and learning? And just explaining this is how we're creating connections between everything that we see. This is where trauma comes from. This is how I might look at a car and think of something totally different than somebody whose family member died in a car accident. We're creating relationships between all these different stimuli, and it's perspective taking. We're building perspective taking and knowing that my relational frame is unique and it's different from anybody else's, and everyone has their own relational frame. So yeah, definitely the perspective building piece, and just seeing objects as more than what they are and seeing events as more than what they are, and really explaining how we build up, how we become people in our learning histories. And again, really reiterating the importance of trauma and how relational frame ties into trauma. And I really recommend that people do get the Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life book, because it really helps put it into an ACT RFT lens of why it's also important and how it all connects, and how some of our thinking needs to be reframed to better fit this model.
Yeah, I really think I've often said, and just to give you a little inside information, Matt really wanted me to have a real controversial question. And I don't know that we've had one yet, but I'm going to make a potentially controversial statement that has led that has led colleagues of mine to send me basically their whole vita about how I'm wrong. I really think that one of the things that we struggle with most as a field is social skills training. I believe that most of the social skills training I've seen out there takes a direct contingency approach to teaching social behavior. And I don't think that's the primary source of control over the acquisition, shaping, and maintenance of social behavior. Right. And I really, I really think as we move forward, we're going to find that teaching children how to better first navigate their private environment that is likely a scarier place than any of us could ever realize, without any skill with arbitrary relations, with very limited relating repertoires, and then how to extend that into their public environment. I think that is going to show. I can't explain it why it's happened over my career, but every child I've seen make the transition from getting really good with arbitrary relations through RFT programming and then starting with ACT, the outcomes I've seen with their social behavior are just superior. Mm-hmm. They don't look wooden. They don't look robotic. They look very flexible and fluid and very competent to go into. And I think that's what we want. But actually, Jennifer added a question at the very end, and it made me so proud because it's very, very pragmatic. But it's, maybe a little bit more or less controversial, we'll see, which is talk a little bit, and this is the last question I'll have, see if Matt has anything else. You're using the VB map when we met. And talk a little bit about the transition. That's usually a big question I hear from BCBAs. It's like, I've been using the VB map. I've had these clients for so long. How do I even make the transition over? So talk a little bit about that from your experience, Jen.
So from a logistical standpoint, if I had a VB map for my initial assessment, in the first reauthorization, I did include the VB map just so that insurance companies had a point of comparison. But then once I started doing peak, then I faded out the VB map. My first step, there are a lot of parallels between VB map and peak. So I just took the skills that I was able to see in the VB map first and accounted for them on the peak module triangles and on the peak assessments, because I knew that was a skill they already had. And then I just went from there. I saw that based on the VB map, my kids had a lot of splinter skills where they were getting things that were seemingly more advanced, but they were missing these foundational learning skills. So I had been spending time and time again teaching 50 objects at a time, when what's great about peak is that, I don't need to teach 50 objects. Maybe I teach 6 or 7, and then I can move on to the next target. And then I can work on it in the generalization module. But I really just copied everything over into the assessments. I pretended like it was a blank slate. Some of them I did the assessments over again because it was a good way for me to tell, was the way that I was teaching a good way to generalize these skills? So I have a client that could have done matching identical pictures time and time again, but if I did the PCA and they couldn't do it, shows me they actually didn't have it. So I did a comment.
I think you bring up, if I can interject real quick there, because I think you bring up a really good point.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the feedback I've seen from our BCBAs is when you switch to the PCA, which is a standardized assessment, it's strange at first, but then you don't realize how much you really have been prompting and correcting when you redo VB map assessments. And this pretty much forces you to see if the child can truly do these things independently. I think that's a really important point.
No, exactly. And I noticed that a lot with my kids. I was reteaching things. And it's to me, I think, because I wasn't really building up their attending skills enough. They were just learning things and memorizing and not actually understanding. So for older kids, I never really did the ABLES and the VB map. It was just never appropriate to me to do it with my older kids because they were off the charts in skills. And I would send it to insurance companies and they would be confused why I was even asking for treatment. And I think peak really embodies some of those deficits that older kids with social challenges may have. So I think just doing the PCA, doing your best to really copy everything over onto the VB map, especially in level 1 and level 2, and then going into more of your deriving stimulus equivalence targets that are not included in VB map is really what took me the longest, because it was just an entirely different part of my brain I'd never accessed before. So yeah, it was definitely hard work at first to transfer everybody over, but I'm really glad that I did, because I think it gives me a better idea of what I'm missing and what I missed that came before it. I think the perk to VB map is getting a better idea of age norm, but there are most things in the VB map are translated over to Peak. Peak just goes a little bit deeper into what do we do next? What do we do after the VB map and these basic milestone skills?
Well, let me just say, Jen, Jen is kind of been one of our leaders in making the transition over, but we have so many BCBAs on our team now that are doing outstanding work. And I just want to say what a privilege it's been, Jen, to watch your own development over the last year and several months, and your enthusiasm and your good, healthy skepticism. And I really look forward to seeing the impact you're going to have on clients' lives for several years to come. And I really, really appreciate you being on our team.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge with me. I'm very, very lucky.
All right. I think we've covered, I don't have any follow up to that. So I think and we've been at this for a little while now. So I think this is probably as good a time as any to wrap things up. So this has been a fun conversation. Thanks for letting me butt into your interview, Jim, more so than I anticipated. But Jen, thanks for being such a good sport, being willing to sit on the hot seat and acquitting yourself so capably here. And congratulations on the great work that you're doing down there at Apollo. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.